In this chapter's lessons, we're going to discuss a great new feature available in iOS 5 called storyboarding. Storyboards provide a new twist on how we've always built iOS apps. Instead of creating and managing nib files and manually transitioning between the various views in our app, storyboards allow us to visually build the various views and then graphically describe the transitions between them. Storyboards define two key items, a scene and a segue. A scene is an individual screen within our app, and this essentially relates to what we have up to this point been building in a nib file. A segue is then used to describe the transition that we take from one scene to the next. There really wasn't an analog for this concept previously, and instead we simply wrote code whenever we wanted to transition from one view controller to the next. Using storyboards can be a big win for a lot of applications, as it requires us to write less code, allows us to visually build and manage how our application flows, and additionally enables some new functionality relating to table views that simply wasn't possible previously. Now that you have a good general overview of storyboarding, in this lesson we'll go through the process of converting our nib-based iMusic app to use storyboards. Although we could continue down the path we're on and build out the remaining parts of our apps using nibs, we really should take advantage of the capabilities and features that iOS 5 storyboarding provides. By converting our app to use storyboards, we'll be able to more quickly prototype and build the remaining features of our application. Converting our nib-based iMusic app to use storyboards won't be too difficult as we haven't built that much functionality yet, but it does require a fair amount of manual steps. So let's walk through those right now. I'll first begin by highlighting the iMusic group, and I'll type Command-N to bring up the new file chooser, and we'll go under the User Interface section and select Storyboard. Our device family will leave set to iPhone, and we'll call this Main Storyboard. Select both my targets and click Create. So this creates an empty canvas for our storyboard. So I'll highlight the root of our project, and under the iPhone iPod deployment info section, let's select our main storyboard as the application's main storyboard. And this is the only configuration we need to set to have our application be aware that it should load this main storyboard when the application starts. With that modified, the other thing we want to change is go over to our app delegate. And interestingly, all of this code that's currently in here, we can remove altogether. Instead, we'll delegate the responsibilities for doing what was happening here off to the storyboard. Now next we want to create our first scene, so I'll select the main storyboard file and open up the Utilities section. And from our Objects library, let's select View Controller, and we'll drag and drop one of these onto the canvas. And in doing so, this created our first scene. Now with this scene highlighted, make sure it's got a blue rectangle around it. Let's switch over to the Identity Inspector, and we'll set that to be our main view controller. Now our main view controller needs to live within the context of a navigation controller. So let's make sure that's highlighted, and we'll go up to the Editor menu and select Embed in Navigation Controller. So this adds a new navigation controller on and adjusts our main view out of the way. But you can see it's set this relationship between the navigation controller and our main view controller. So this identifies the main view controller as being the root view controller for the nav controller. So I'm going to go to the main view nib, and I will type Command A to select all components and Command C to copy them. I'll go back to my storyboard file and select my main storyboard scene and type Command V to paste. So this pasted all of the components over. So I'll position these about where they were previously. So we can delete our main view nib. So I'll highlight it and hit the delete key. And this is going to prompt me with the following dialog. Do you want to move the file main view nib to the trash or only remove the reference to it? If I select remove reference, it's simply going to remove it from my project but won't actually remove the file from disk. Instead, I want to say move to trash. So that removed it completely. Now I'll select my main view scene and open up the assistant editor. When we copied the user interface components from our nib into here, the one thing that it doesn't do is copy all of the connections. So you can see all of these are currently unset. But we can fix that up quite easily. So I'll control drag from my image view onto my image view property. And we can see we hooked that back up again. And view list, I will hook up to the view list button. About to the about button property. And additionally, let's also hook up the action methods. So view list, I'll hook back up to show list. And the one on the bottom, I'll hook up to the show about view. Hit Command B. And I'll run the app. And click the various buttons. And as you can see, everything's working just as it was in the last section. But we haven't converted all of our other components over to use these storyboards. What you'll find is your app can contain both storyboard-based resources as well as nib-based resources, and these can happily coexist with each other. Now, however, for consistency's sake, I will convert the remaining features of the app to use storyboards. So I'll quit the simulator, and let's close that. Actually, I'll open that back up again. And I want to add another scene for our About view. So I'll select View Controller and drag and drop this into our storyboard. Now I can shrink this down a little bit so that we can see this a little more easily. And let me set its class type to About View Controller. I'll highlight the About iMusic button. Kind of need to zoom in before I'm able to actually edit the individual components. But I'll control drag from the button to my new scene that I added. And I'll get this little pop-up that asks me to specify the segue type. Since we want to display our About view in a modal presentation, I'll select modal. Shrink this back down and align this a little more neatly. And just like we did with the main view, let's go to our About view nib. And I'll type Command A to select all components, Command C to copy, zoom in on our storyboard, and I'll type Command V to paste. Alright, so I'll position that as it was previously. And just like we did with the main view, I'll delete the About view. So hit the delete key and say move to trash. Go back to the storyboard and open up the assistant editor. I'll highlight the done button and control drag to the dismiss About view method. And I will hook up this delete and reset sample data button to this method. Alright, so that looks good. Let's add one more scene for our music list view controller. This time I'll select Table View Controller. I'll drag that on to here. And I'll set the class type to Music List View Controller. And let's set up a segue from our View List button to this new scene. So I will control drag. And this time I'll select Push. Now before I forget, I still have these buttons hooked up to those action methods. So currently I have the touch up and side hooked up to the show list method, so I'm going to hit this cancel button and break that connection. I'll do the same thing for my iMusic button. I'll right click on it and disconnect the About iMusic button. As long as I'm here, I'll switch to the assistant editor quick. I'll actually delete these methods altogether since we won't need them anymore. Switch over to the implementation. So I can delete these all together. I always love deleting code. Alright, I'll shrink that back down, and then let's focus on our music list scene. Now I can give this a title here. I'll call this iMusic list. And I'll highlight the cell and go to its attributes. Now it's currently set to custom. I'm going to change that to basic. And I also need to specify a reuse identifier for this. So I'll call this cell album cell. As the table view is dequeuing reusable cells, it will use this album cell identifier. Let me switch over to the music list view controller. and I can make a little change to my cell for row at index path method. One of the nice things about using storyboards is we can lose this little dance of checking if the cell is nil, and if it is nil, creating a new one. Instead, we can always be assured that our cell is going to be a valid cell instance when we request it. So I can delete this code altogether, and let me just delete this cell identifier. And instead, I'll just type in that string that I specified in Interface Builder. I'll call that album cell. Let me compile this. And as long as I'm in here, I also know that this code will be going away. So at least for the time being, I'm going to simply comment this out. All right, let's run the app again and see how things look. So I'll first check the About screen. That looks good. So that's very cool that we can show this transition without writing any code to do it. Let's also check our view list, and that works just like it always did before. Beautiful, everything looks great. So we've covered a lot of ground in this lesson. We took our existing nib-based iMusic app and converted it to use storyboards. Definitely required a fair amount of steps, but the good thing is now we'll be able to leverage all of the cool storyboarding features from here on out. As an added bonus, we also got to remove a fair amount of code along the way. So less code that we have to write means fewer opportunities to create bugs. You should now have a good understanding of what it takes to convert a nib-based application to a storyboard-based app.